August 7th, 1943. 23,000 feet above Ploiesti, Romania. The B-24 Liberator shuddered as flak burst around it, black flowers of explosive death blooming in the clear summer sky. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes held his aircraft steady despite the flames now streaming from his No. 2 engine. The fuel refineries below represented 40% of Germany's entire petroleum production. His bomb bay doors were already open. Through the windscreen, Hughes could see the target ahead. Thick black smoke from earlier bombing runs obscured the aiming points. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air with shrapnel. The bomber to his left exploded, torn apart by a direct hit. Hughes never wavered. At 300 feet altitude, flying straight through the inferno, he released his bombs directly onto the target. The Liberator climbed away, trailing fire. The crew prepared to bail out. Hughes fought the controls, trying to gain enough altitude for his men to escape. At 400 feet, the left-wing fuel tank exploded. The aircraft rolled inverted and crashed. All crew members died instantly. Lloyd Hughes received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His sacrifice was one of hundreds made that day over Ploiesti. Operation Tidal Wave cost 53 B-24 Liberators and 532 aircrew casualties. The raid has been called one of the costliest single-day air operations of World War II. And yet, despite the losses, despite the dangers, the B-24 Liberator would fly more combat missions than any other American aircraft in the war. It would drop more bombs than the more famous B-17 Flying Fortress. It would serve in every theater, every role, from submarine hunting to strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe called it an easy target, a vulnerable bomber that German fighters would destroy in droves. The reality would prove devastatingly different. The story of how an aircraft dismissed as inferior became the most produced American military aircraft in history begins not with military planners, but with a single company's determination to build something better than anyone thought possible. 1939, San Diego, California. Consolidated Aircraft Corporation occupied a sprawling facility on the waterfront where designers worked on what would become the most controversial bomber of the war. The company's chief designer, Isaac Ladden, held the specifications from the United States Army Air Corps in his hands. The requirements seemed impossible. Range of 3,000 miles with a 2,000-pound bomb load, cruising speed over 200 miles per hour. Service ceiling above 30,000 feet, the ability to fly higher, faster, and farther than any existing bomber. Consolidated had earned its reputation building flying boats, massive seaplanes that crossed oceans. Ladden understood long-range aircraft design better than almost anyone in America. He knew that meeting the Army specifications would require revolutionary approaches to aerodynamics, structure, and systems. The B-17 Flying Fortress, already in production by Boeing, represented the current standard. It was tough, reliable, heavily armed, but its range was limited. Its bomb capacity was modest. The Army wanted something that could reach deeper into enemy territory and deliver heavier punishment. Ladden's design team began with a clean sheet. They studied every aspect of aerodynamic efficiency. The fuselage would be deep and slab-sided, maximizing internal volume for fuel and bombs while minimizing drag. The wing would use a revolutionary high aspect ratio design, long and narrow, like a glider's wing. This configuration provided exceptional lift-to-drag ratio, critical for long-range flight. The Davis airfoil, a relatively new wing profile, offered lower drag than conventional airfoils at high speeds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The design incorporated twin vertical tails instead of the single tail common on most bombers. This configuration reduced weight while improving control stability. It also allowed the rear gunner a clear field of fire without the tail blocking his view. The tricycle landing gear, with the nose wheel forward, represented another departure from standard practice. Most bombers used tail wheel configurations where the tail sat on the ground and the nose pointed upward when parked. The tricycle gear gave pilots better visibility during taxi and takeoff and it made the aircraft more stable on the ground. Every design choice prioritized efficiency and range. Weight was calculated obsessively. Structures were analyzed to remove every unnecessary ounce. Fuel capacity was maximized, with tanks in the wings, fuselage, and even bomb bay. The goal was simple: carry the maximum bomb, load the maximum distance at the maximum speed. The prototype, designated XB-24, first flew on December 29, 1939. Test pilot Bill Wheatley pushed the aircraft through its initial trials over San Diego Bay. The performance numbers validated Ladden's revolutionary design. Maximum speed exceeded 300 miles per hour. Service ceiling reached 31,000 feet. Range with full fuel load and a reduced bomb load exceeded 3,000 miles. The Army Air Corps ordered 7 service test aircraft in April 1939, even before the prototype flew. By the time testing confirmed the design's potential, orders were already flowing. France ordered 120 aircraft in March 1940. Britain ordered 164 under the export designation LB-30. The Air Corps expanded its own order to 36 YB-24 seconds and then ordered 38 more. Production ramped up rapidly, but the B-24 design incorporated trade-offs that would become controversial. The high aspect ratio Davis wing that gave such excellent range made the aircraft less forgiving in flight. The wing had a higher stall speed than conventional designs. It generated less lift at low speeds. Pilots needed to maintain higher approach speeds during landing, lose speed at the wrong moment, and the B-24 would drop like a stone. The wing also proved vulnerable to battle damage. A single flak burst or cannon shell hit could destroy enough wing structure to cause catastrophic failure. The B-17's broader, thicker wing could absorb more punishment and keep flying. The B-24's efficient but slender wing could not. The fuselage design, optimized for internal volume, created another vulnerability. The bomb bay doors rolled up on tracks along the fuselage sides, rather than opening downward like conventional doors. This saved weight and reduced drag, but it meant the bomb bay could not be used as an emergency exit. If a B-24 was hit and the crew needed to bail out, they could not drop through the bomb bay. They had to exit through side hatches or the forward nose wheel compartment. In a damaged spinning bomber, this made escape far more difficult. The tricycle landing gear, while improving ground handling, placed enormous loads on the nose wheel during landing. Heavy landings could collapse the nose gear, sending the aircraft skidding on its nose. Pilots learned to make gentle, precise landings. Sloppy technique could destroy the aircraft. These design compromises would cost lives throughout the war. Yet the B-24's advantages in range and bomb capacity made it indispensable. The Army Air Forces needed bombers that could reach deep into enemy territory. They needed aircraft that could carry heavy loads across vast Pacific distances. They needed production numbers that could replace losses and build overwhelming force. The B-24 could deliver all of this, if crews could master its demands. Production began at Consolidated San Diego plant in 1941. By December, when Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, 59 B-24 seconds had been delivered. The production rate was inadequate for wartime needs. America would need thousands of heavy bombers, not dozens. The solution was mass production on a scale never before attempted for such a complex machine. Ford Motor Company, which had revolutionized automobile manufacturing with assembly line techniques, received a contract to build B-24 seconds at a massive new facility near Ypsilanti, Michigan. The Willow Run plant would become the largest single production facility under one roof in the world. Construction began in April 1941. By March 1942, the first components were being manufactured. By September 1942, the first complete B-24 rolled off the line. Willow Run's scale defied comprehension. The main assembly building measured 3,500 feet long and 1,280 feet wide at its widest point. It covered 3.5 million square feet of floor space. The final assembly line stretched 2/3 of a mile. At peak production, the plant employed 42,000 workers operating 3 shifts around the clock. Raw materials entered one end of the building. Finished bombers emerged from the other. Every 63 minutes at maximum production, a new B-24 was completed. Ford's assembly line approach required breaking the aircraft into sub-assemblies that could be manufactured separately and then joined together. The nose section, flight deck, bomb bay, rear fuselage, wings, and tail were all built on separate lines. Workers specialized in specific tasks, becoming extraordinarily efficient through repetition. Quality control inspectors checked every rivet, every weld, every system installation. The precision required for aircraft manufacturing was far greater than for automobiles. A defective rivet in a car door might cause an annoying rattle. A defective rivet in a bomber wing could cause catastrophic structural failure at altitude. Women comprised approximately 1/3 of Willow Run's workforce. They operated drill presses, bucking bars for riveting, and complex machine tools. They read technical blueprints and performed precision measurements. The iconic Rosie the Riveter image represented these real women, whose skills built the aircraft that would pound German and Japanese targets. By the war's end, Willow Run had produced 8,685 B-24 seconds, representing nearly half of all B-24 seconds built. But Ford was not the only manufacturer. Consolidated built B-24 seconds at both San Diego and a new plant in Fort Worth, Texas. Douglas Aircraft built them in Tulsa, Oklahoma. North American Aviation built them in Dallas, Texas. At peak production in 1944, these 5 plants were completing a combined 330 B-24 seconds every month. Total B-24 production reached 18,482 aircraft by the time production ended in May 1945. This made the B-24 the most produced American military aircraft in history. The B-17, more famous and more beloved by its crews, was produced in smaller numbers. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega built 12,731 B-17 seconds total. The B-24 outnumbered the Flying Fortress by nearly 6,000 aircraft. Yet popular memory has elevated the B-17 while often overlooking the more numerous Liberator. The reasons for this disparity reveal much about perception versus reality. The B-17 looked like what people expected a bomber to look like. Its graceful lines, single tail, and symmetrical appearance photographed beautifully. It appeared in newsreels and magazine covers. Hollywood featured B-17 seconds in films like 12 O'Clock High and Memphis Belle. The B-24, with its slab-sided fuselage, twin tails, and ungainly proportions, looked awkward by comparison. It photographed poorly. It did not inspire the same aesthetic appreciation, but wars are not won by beautiful aircraft. They are won by aircraft that accomplish missions and return crews safely. B-24 variants entered service quickly as America mobilized for war. The B-24A featured only minor changes from the ex-B-24 prototype. 9 were built. The B-24C incorporated turbo superchargers that enabled high-altitude performance. Only 7 were built, but they proved the concept. The B-24D became the first major production variant. 3,638 were built between January 1942 and September 1943. The B-24D had 4 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Maximum speed was 303 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling was 32,000 feet. Range was 3,000 miles with a reduced bomb load. Maximum bomb load was 8,000 pounds for shorter missions. Normal bomb load was 5,000 pounds. Defensive armament initially consisted of 10 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 2 in a powered nose turret, 2 in a powered dorsal turret, 2 in a powered ventral ball turret, 2 in the tail, and 1 flexible gun in each waist position. Later variants increased this to 11 guns. The crew numbered 10 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer who also served as top turret gunner, radio operator, nose turret gunner, ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and tail gunner. These men would fly the B-24 into combat across every theatre of World War II. They would face fighter attacks, flak, weather, mechanical failures, and the constant stress of flying missions where survival was never guaranteed. The Luftwaffe would learn that the aircraft they dismissed as an easy target was anything but. 1942. The 8th Air Force arrived in England with a mission to bring strategic bombing to the heart of Nazi Germany. The theory of strategic bombing held that destroying enemy industry, transportation, and resources would cripple their ability to wage war. Heavy bombers would fly deep into enemy territory in daylight, protected by their own defensive armament and tight formation flying. They would strike with precision against specific targets: aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, marshalling yards. The destruction of these targets would, theoretically, bring Germany to its knees without requiring a ground invasion. The reality would prove far bloodier and more complex than the theory suggested. But in 1942, American air commanders believed in the doctrine. They believed the B-17 and B-24 could defend themselves against fighter attack. They believed German defences could be overwhelmed by sufficient numbers. They believed precision bombing would win the war. The B-24 groups began arriving in England in late 1942. The 93rd Bomb Group, the first B-24 unit in Europe, flew its first mission on October 9, 1942 against a steel plant in Lille, France. The raid achieved little damage but demonstrated that liberators could reach targets and return. Early missions revealed problems immediately. German fighters attacked with ferocity. The Luftwaffe had learned to fear American heavy bombers, but they had also learned how to destroy them. Head-on attacks exploited the bombers' weakest defensive position. The early B-24D had limited forward-firing guns. A determined fighter pilot, diving from above and slightly ahead, could fire hundreds of cannon and machine gun rounds into the bomber's nose, cockpit, and engines before breaking away. Many B-24 seconds were lost to head-on attacks before they even reached their targets. Flak proved equally deadly. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns fired time-fused shells that exploded at predetermined altitudes, creating clouds of shrapnel. A bomber formation approaching a heavily defended target flew through a steel storm. Shrapnel punched through aluminum skin, severed control cables, punctured fuel tanks, wounded or killed crew members. The B-24's thin wing structure made it particularly vulnerable. A flak burst near the wing could damage structural spars or fuel tanks. Fuel streamed from holes, creating fire hazards and reducing range. In severe cases, the wing would fail catastrophically. Formation flying demanded intense concentration and precise aircraft control. Bombers flew in tight boxes, each aircraft maintaining exact position relative to others. This concentration of firepower allowed the formation to defend itself against fighter attack, but flying formation required constant attention. Pilots fought turbulence from other aircraft's propeller wash. They maintained position while wearing oxygen masks in unpressurized aircraft at altitudes where temperatures dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. They did this for missions lasting 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours. The physical and mental strain was immense. Crews wore electrically heated flight suits, but the systems often failed. Frostbite was common. Gunners in exposed positions suffered terribly. The ball turret gunner, suspended beneath the aircraft in a tiny sphere, could not wear a parachute. There was no room. If the aircraft was hit and going down, the ball turret had to be rotated to the exit position before the gunner could climb out. If the electrical system failed or the turret was damaged, the gunner was trapped. He would ride the aircraft down, fully conscious and aware, unable to escape. This was one of the most psychologically tormenting aspects of flying B-24 seconds in combat. Crews developed superstitions and rituals. Some wore lucky charms, others followed exact routines before each mission. They wrote letters home before every flight, knowing each mission might be their last. They formed bonds with crew members that transcended normal friendship. These were the men you trusted with your life, who depended on you for theirs. Loss of a crew member, whether killed or severely wounded, devastated morale. The Sub-8th Air Force suffered horrific casualties throughout 1943 and into 1944. Some groups lost more aircraft than they had been initially equipped with. Replacement crews arrived fresh from training in America, flew a few missions, and died. The statistics were brutal. 8th Air Force crew members had a statistical survival rate that made completing a 25-mission tour questionable at best. Later, the required tour was increased to 30 missions, then 35. The odds of survival decreased accordingly. Yet men continued to volunteer. They believed in the mission. They believed strategic bombing would hasten Germany's defeat. They believed their sacrifice mattered. And despite the losses, despite the fear, they climbed into their B-24 seconds mission after mission and flew into the teeth of German defences. The Luftwaffe learned quickly that B-24 seconds were not easy targets. The Liberator's speed advantage over the B-17, though modest, made intercepts more difficult. Its higher service ceiling allowed formations to fly above some flak concentrations. Its heavier defensive armament, when fully installed in later models, could devastate attacking fighters. German fighter pilots developed specific tactics for attacking B-24 formations. They preferred attacking from the front where defensive firepower was weakest. They coordinated attacks from multiple directions, simultaneously, to divide defensive fire. They used rockets launched from outside machine gun range to break up formations. They pressed attacks with determination bordering on fanaticism, knowing that every bomber destroyed was one less load of bombs falling on German cities. But Luftwaffe pilots also learned to respect the B-24. Its gunners were well-trained and motivated. A bomber under attack would maneuver violently, making gunnery difficult for the attacking fighter. Other bombers in the formation would concentrate fire on any fighter pressing an attack. More than one. German pilot found himself flying through a cone of 50 caliber tracers, knowing that any one of those bullets could destroy his aircraft or end his life. The mutual respect between bomber crews and fighter pilots was real. They were trying to kill each other, but they recognized courage when they saw it. The Ploiesti raid of August 1st, 1943, exemplified both the B-24's capabilities and the horrific cost of strategic bombing. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiesti supplied 40% of Germany's petroleum. Destroying these refineries would cripple German fuel production for aviation, armour, and transport. The potential strategic impact justified extraordinary risks. Operation Tidal Wave involved 177 B-24 Liberators from 5 bomb groups based in Libya. They would fly a low-level attack, surprising defenders by approaching at altitudes as low as 100 feet. Low altitude would reduce the effectiveness of German flak and eliminate fighter advantages. The mission plan was complex and ambitious. The bombers would fly 1,600 miles across the Mediterranean, over mountains, through valleys, to reach Ploiesti. They would attack from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm defences. Each group had specific targets within the refinery complex. Timing and navigation had to be perfect. Any delay or navigation error would allow defenders to concentrate fire on subsequent waves. Everything went wrong almost immediately. Navigation errors caused some groups to approach the target late, losing the element of surprise. German and Romanian defenders had time to prepare. By the time the attacking bombers arrived, flak guns and fighters were positioned and waiting. The B-24 seconds pressed their attacks anyway. At altitudes of 50 to 300 feet, they flew directly over their targets through walls of flak and small arms fire. Some flew so low they were below the level of refinery smokestacks. Some aircraft actually flew between the smokestacks, threading through the refinery structures to reach their assigned targets. The bombers dropped delayed fuse bombs to avoid destroying themselves with their own explosions at such low altitude, but some bombs exploded prematurely, damaging or destroying following aircraft. The entire attack became a chaotic, burning nightmare. Aircraft exploded in mid-air, others crashed into refineries or ploughed into the ground. Crew members bailed out over enemy territory, becoming prisoners if they survived. 53 B-24 seconds were lost that day, representing 30% of the attacking force. 532 aircrew were casualties, 166 killed, 108 captured, and many wounded. 5 medals of honor were awarded for Ploiesti, more than for any other single-day air action in the war. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes was one of 5 recipients. Colonel John Kane, Colonel Leon Johnson, and Major John Jerstad received their medals for leading their formations through the inferno and successfully bombing their targets despite overwhelming fire. Second Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes received his posthumously for maintaining his burning aircraft on the target run and releasing his bombs before attempting to save his crew. The damage inflicted on Ploiesti's refineries was significant but not decisive. Production dropped by approximately 46% initially, but German engineers worked furiously to repair damage. Within months, production had recovered to near pre-raid levels. The strategic objective, crippling German oil production, was not achieved. The cost in lives and aircraft seemed disproportionate to results, yet the raid demonstrated that B-24 crews possessed courage equal to any warriors in history. Flying into that hell at low altitude, knowing survival was unlikely, and completing their bombing runs anyway represented the highest form of devotion to duty. The Ploiesti survivors returned to their bases in Libya. They had flown over 1,600 miles each way, fought through intense defences, and completed one of the war's most costly missions. Those who completed subsequent missions carried the memory of Ploiesti with them. They knew what the B-24 could endure. They knew what they themselves could endure. And they knew the price of strategic bombing was paid in blood and burning aluminum. The Pacific Theatre presented challenges perfectly suited to the B-24's strengths and brutally exposed its weaknesses. The vast distances between island bases demanded long-range aircraft. The B-17's shorter range made it less suitable for Pacific operations. The B-24, with its 3,000-mile range, could reach targets the Flying Fortress could not. This made the Liberator essential to Pacific strategy despite the continuing controversies over its flight characteristics. The 5th Air Force, under General George Kenney, operated B-24 seconds throughout the Southwest Pacific. They flew from bases in Australia, then New Guinea, then the Philippines as American forces advanced. Their missions ranged from strategic bombing of Japanese installations to direct support of ground forces during amphibious landings. The distances involved were staggering. A mission from Darwin, Australia to targets in the Dutch East Indies covered over 1,500 miles one way. Crews flew 6 to 8 hour missions over open ocean, where navigation errors could mean flying until fuel exhaustion, with no emergency landing options. Weather in the Pacific was often worse than over Europe. Typhoons spawned massive storm systems with turbulence that could tear aircraft apart. Cumulus clouds towered to 40,000 feet, higher than B-24 seconds could climb. Flying through these clouds meant severe turbulence, icing, and lightning strikes. Flying around them consumed precious fuel and added hours to already long missions. Crews learned to read weather patterns and choose routes that balanced fuel consumption against weather risks. The judgment required was extraordinary, and mistakes were fatal. Japanese fighter opposition was initially less sophisticated than German opposition, but it was no less determined. Japanese pilots flew with a fanaticism that shocked American crews. They pressed attacks to suicidal range. They deliberately rammed bombers when ammunition was exhausted. The kamikaze mentality existed long before formal kamikaze units were organized. A Japanese pilot who had failed to shoot down a bomber might dive his fighter directly into it rather than return to base having failed his mission. This made Japanese fighters terrifying opponents despite their lighter armament compared to German fighters. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses improved dramatically as the war progressed. Early in the war, Japanese flak was relatively ineffective. By 1944, Japanese gunners had learned from experience and received better equipment. Flak over targets like Rabaul, Truk, and later Manila became as deadly as anything over Europe. The advantage the Pacific offered was that many targets were less heavily defended than German industrial centers. but heavily defended targets in the Pacific were just as dangerous as anything in Europe. The 7th Air Force operated B-24 seconds in the Central Pacific, flying from Hawaii, then the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, and eventually Okinawa. These island-hopping campaigns presented unique challenges. Each newly captured island required construction of airfields capable of handling heavy bombers. Engineers worked under fire to build runways, taxiways, revetments, and support facilities. Until airfields were operational, bombers flew from bases hundreds or thousands of miles away. The longest regular combat mission of the war was flown by B-24 seconds from the 7th Air Force. In March 1945, B-24 seconds flew from Guam to Singapore and return, a distance of over 4,000 miles. The mission lasted over 20 hours. Crews sat in cramped positions for nearly a full day, maintaining formation, navigating over featureless ocean, bombing their target, and returning. The physical and mental endurance required exceeded anything demanded in Europe. The 10th and 14th Air Forces operated B-24 seconds from bases in India and China against Japanese targets throughout Asia. These operations faced supply problems that made European logistics look simple. Everything had to be flown over the Himalayas, a route known as the hump. Aircraft, fuel, bombs, spare parts, food, all came by air over some of the world's most dangerous flying terrain. Mountains rose to 25,000 feet. Weather was unpredictable and violent. Hundreds of transport aircraft were lost flying the hump, and the heavy bomber units they supplied sometimes could not fly missions because fuel or bombs had not arrived. Yet these units persisted. They bombed Japanese shipping in the South China Sea. They struck airfields, supply depots, and rail yards throughout Japanese-occupied China and Southeast Asia. They supported Chinese ground forces by interdicting Japanese supply lines. The strategic impact was modest compared to operations in Europe, but the operational achievement under such difficult logistics was remarkable. B-24 seconds in the Pacific also performed anti-shipping missions, a role for which they were particularly well suited. Japanese supply lines to their scattered island garrisons stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Cargo ships, tankers, and troop transports were vulnerable to air attack. B-24 seconds, equipped with specialized radar, could locate ships at night or in bad weather. They would attack from medium altitude with bombs, or occasionally from low altitude with bombs and machine gun fire. The effectiveness of anti-shipping strikes varied. A direct hit with a 2,000-pound bomb could sink even a large cargo ship. Near misses might cause serious damage. But ships were small targets, difficult to hit from. Altitude. Many missions returned without significant results, yet the cumulative effect of anti-shipping campaigns was substantial. Japan lost thousands of merchant ships during the war, and air attacks accounted for a significant portion. Every ship sunk was one less load of supplies reaching Japanese forces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The submarine warfare role revealed another dimension of B-24 versatility that the Luftwaffe never anticipated. The B-24's long range made it ideal for anti-submarine patrol, and modified variants became some of the most effective submarine hunters of the war. German U-boats in the Atlantic had nearly succeeded in cutting Britain's supply lines in 1942 and early 1943. Convoys lost ships faster than they could be replaced. The mid-Atlantic gap, beyond the range of land-based aircraft, became a hunting ground where U-boats operated with relative impunity. The B-24 closed that gap. Modified PB-4Y1 variants, operated by the Navy, and B-24D variants operated by the Army Air Forces, provided very long-range patrol capability. They could fly 1,500-mile patrols, remain on station for hours, and return safely. They were equipped with radar that could detect surfaced submarines at ranges of 10 to 15 miles. They carried depth charges that could sink a submarine if delivered accurately. The typical anti-submarine patrol was brutally monotonous, punctuated by moments of intense action. Crews flew for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours over empty ocean. They scanned the surface for the telltale wake of a periscope or the silhouette of a surfaced submarine. Hour after hour of nothing, eyes strained from staring at grey water under grey sky. Then, suddenly, radar contact. The aircraft would close on the contact, descending rapidly. If the submarine was still on the surface, the B-24 would attack immediately, dropping depth charges in a pattern calculated to bracket the target. U-boats could crash dive in less than 30 seconds once they spotted an aircraft. The time from detection to attack was critical. Every second delayed gave the submarine time to submerge and escape. B-24 crews became experts at rapid attacks. They would approach at low altitude, 200 feet or less, at high speed. The bombardier would calculate the release point accounting for the aircraft's speed, altitude, and the submarine's movement. The depth charges would release, splashing into the water in a pattern around the submarine's position. They would sink to predetermined depths and explode, creating massive underwater shock waves. A submarine caught by a well-placed depth charge pattern was finished. The pressure hull would crack, water would flood in, the submarine would sink or be forced to surface where it could be finished off with machine gun fire or more depth charges. Crew members would attempt to escape, but survival in the Atlantic was measured in minutes. The water temperature would kill even those who reached the surface alive. The battle against U-boats was a mathematical calculation of attrition. Germany built submarines faster than they could initially be sunk, but Allied anti-submarine capability improved relentlessly. Radar became more sensitive. Depth charges became more powerful. Tactics improved through experience. By mid-1943, U-boat losses exceeded production. By 1944, operating in the Atlantic had become suicidal for German submarines. B-24 seconds contributed significantly to this victory. Navy records credit PB-4Y1 Liberators and Army Air Force's B-24 seconds with sinking or participating in the sinking of at least 72 U-boats during the war. This represented a substantial portion of total U-boat losses. The long-range patrol capability that the B-24 provided closed the mid-Atlantic gap and made submarine operations untenable. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat force, acknowledged after the war that Allied air power made submarine operations impossible by 1944. Long-range patrol aircraft, primarily B-24 seconds and British Liberators, were central to that air power. The development of improved B-24 variants addressed some of the aircraft's early problems while introducing new capabilities. The B-24E incorporated improved propellers and minor systems upgrades. 801 were built. The B-24G featured a powered nose turret mounting two 50-caliber machine guns. This addressed the aircraft's vulnerability to head-on attacks. The powered nose turret became standard on subsequent variants. 405 B-24Gs were built. The B-24H incorporated numerous improvements, including better turbo supercharger installations, improved hydraulics, and the standardized powered nose turret. This became one of the major production variants. 3,100 were built. The B-24J was the most produced variant with 6,678 built. It featured improved autopilot, better instruments, and enhanced electrical systems. Late production B-24Js received improved turbo superchargers that increased high-altitude performance. The B-24 liters was a weight reduction variant that replaced the ball turret with a manually operated flexible gun mount. This saved weight and complexity but reduced defensive capability. 1,667 were built. The B-24M restored the ball turret but incorporated other weight-saving measures. 2,593 were built. The final production variant, the B-24 Newtons, featured a single tail instead of the twin-tail configuration and an improved nose section. Only 7 were built before production ended in May 1945. British Royal Air Force Coastal Command operated Liberators extensively in the anti-submarine role. RAF designations included Liberator GR, Mark 1 through Mark 8, with various subvariants for specific missions. RAF Liberators flew patrol missions over the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean. They provided convoy escort, hunted submarines, and performed maritime reconnaissance. RAF crews praised the Liberator's range and reliability while noting the same handling characteristics that American crews found challenging. The Canadian Air Force operated Liberators from bases in Newfoundland and Iceland, covering Atlantic convoy routes. Royal Australian Air Force B-24 Seconds flew anti-submarine patrols in the Indian Ocean and South Pacific. South African Air Force Liberators operated from bases in Africa and the Middle East. The B-24 served with numerous Allied air forces, a testament to its capabilities despite its controversial reputation. Combat operations revealed the price of the B-24's efficiency. The high aspect ratio Davis wing that provided such excellent range proved vulnerable to battle damage in ways the B-17's wing was not. A B-17 could absorb shocking amounts of structural damage and continue flying. There are documented cases of B-17 seconds returning to base with massive holes in the fuselage, destroyed engines, shredded control surfaces. The aircraft's robust structure and relatively forgiving flight characteristics meant that even severely damaged B-17 seconds could be nursed home. The B-24 was less forgiving. Battle damage to the wing structure often caused catastrophic failure. The wing would fold, the aircraft would enter an uncontrollable spin, and the crew would have seconds to bail out before impact. Many did not make it. The bomb bay exit problem made emergency escape more difficult than in the B-17. Crew members trapped in damaged B-24 seconds, unable to reach exit hatches, rode their aircraft down, fully aware they were going to die. The psychological horror of this situation haunted survivors. The higher landing speed required by the Davis wing meant that damaged B-24 seconds attempting emergency landings often crashed. An injured pilot struggling with damaged controls might not be able to maintain the precise speed and attitude required for landing. The aircraft would stall at the worst possible moment, dropping from 50 feet onto the runway. Many crew members survived combat only to die in landing crashes at their home bases. These factors contributed to a perception among crews that the B-24 was less safe than the B-17. Statistics do not entirely support this perception. Loss rates for B-24 and B-17 units were roughly comparable when accounting for mission types and operational theatres. But perception matters to men risking their lives. Many crew members preferred the B-17, even though objective data suggested the difference in survival rates was small. Yet the B-24 had passionate advocates. Pilots who mastered its demands appreciated its performance. The B-24 was faster than the B-17 by 15 to 20 miles per hour. It had longer range, carried a heavier bomb load, and flew higher. Missions that were marginal or impossible for B-17 seconds were routine for B-24 seconds. In the Pacific, where range was everything, the B-24's advantages outweighed its handling challenges. Crews who flew B-24 seconds exclusively often developed loyalty to the aircraft comparable to the legendary devotion B-17 crews felt for the Flying Fortress. The bombing accuracy debate continues to generate controversy. B-17 advocates argue the Flying Fortress provided a more stable bombing platform, allowing more accurate bomb delivery. B-24 advocates counter that the Liberator's speed and altitude advantages positioned it better for accurate bombing. The reality is that accuracy depended more on bombardier skill, target visibility, and defensive conditions than on aircraft type. Both aircraft achieved comparable accuracy under similar conditions. The total bomb tonnage delivered by B-24 seconds exceeded that delivered by B-17 seconds despite the Flying Fortress's more famous reputation. 8th Air Force B-24. Groups dropped approximately 452,000 tons of bombs over Europe. B-17 groups dropped approximately 640,000 tons. However, when Pacific, Mediterranean, and China-Burma-India theatre operations are included, B-24 total tonnage exceeds B-17 tonnage significantly. The most comprehensive estimates suggest B-24 seconds dropped approximately 635,000 tons of bombs during the war, compared to approximately 640,000 tons for B-17 seconds. The difference is modest but symbolically significant. The more numerous B-24, operating in more theatres, delivering slightly more total tonnage, receives far less recognition in popular memory than the more famous B-17. This disparity between achievement and recognition reflects factors beyond military performance. The B-17's aesthetic appeal, its earlier deployment, and deliberate public relations efforts by Boeing all contributed to its fame. The B-24, less photogenic and less promoted, faded from public consciousness despite equal or superior operational achievements. Crew survival rates tell their own story. Completing a combat tour in either aircraft type was a feat of survival. Early in the war, the odds were frankly terrible. During 1943, the statistical probability of surviving 25 missions over Europe was less than 25%. More than three-quarters of crews would be killed, severely wounded, or captured before completing their tours. The numbers improved as fighter escorts became available, air superiority was achieved, and German defences weakened. But even late in the war, combat flying remained extraordinarily dangerous. The psychological toll on air crews was immense. Every mission brought the possibility of death. Flak could destroy an aircraft without warning. Fighter attacks could kill before gunners could respond. Mechanical failures could doom even an undamaged aircraft. Mid-air collisions in formation were rare but catastrophic. Weather could kill as easily as enemy action. Ice could form on wings. Engines could quit in extreme cold. Navigation errors over clouds could lead to fuel exhaustion over enemy territory or open ocean. Crew members developed their own ways of coping. Some became fatalistic, believing survival was pure luck beyond their control. Others became meticulous, checking every system, following every procedure exactly, believing discipline would save them. Most simply did their jobs day after day, mission after mission, trying not to think too much about statistics or what happened to crews that did not return. The bonds between crew members provided psychological support that was often the difference between completing a tour and breaking down under stress. The phenomenon of flak-happy crews, men who had absorbed too much combat stress and could no longer function effectively, was well documented. Symptoms included inability to sleep, tremors, emotional outbursts, paranoia, and in severe cases, complete psychological breakdown. The 8th Air Force provided rest facilities where exhausted crews could recuperate between missions, but some men never recovered. They had used up their psychological reserves and had nothing left. These men were quietly rotated to non-combat positions if possible, or sent home if their condition made continued service impossible. The ground crews who maintained the B-24 seconds deserve recognition equal to the air crews who flew them. Keeping complex four-engine bombers operational in combat conditions required extraordinary skill and dedication. Mechanics worked through all weather, day and night, to repair battle damage, replace engines, fix hydraulic leaks, patch holes, and perform routine maintenance. They worked knowing that the quality of their work directly affected crew survival. A loose connection, a missed inspection item, a part installed incorrectly, could cause catastrophic failure in flight. The maintenance challenges in Pacific theaters were particularly severe. Humidity caused corrosion, sand abraded engine components, tropical heat affected hydraulic fluids and electrical systems. Spare parts had to be shipped thousands of miles, and shortages were common. Mechanics improvised solutions using whatever materials were available. They cannibalized wrecked aircraft for parts. They manufactured replacement components using machine tools in field workshops. They kept aircraft flying through ingenuity and determination when proper parts and equipment were not available. Women served as mechanics, sheet metal workers, and in other technical positions both in the United States and at some forward bases. They performed the same work as male mechanics and met the same standards. The idea that women could not handle the technical demands of aircraft maintenance was disproven daily by women who repaired engines, welded structural components, and troubleshot complex electrical systems. Their contribution to keeping the B-24 fleet operational was essential, even though it receives little recognition in popular histories. By late 1944, Allied air superiority over Europe was total. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest American daylight bombing raids in strength. German fighter production had been disrupted by bombing. Pilot training had been reduced due to fuel shortages. Experienced pilots had been killed and replaced by inadequately trained novices. The few veteran German pilots who survived into late 1944 faced overwhelming numerical disadvantages. American fighter escorts, primarily P-51 Mustangs, ranged freely over Germany, destroying any Luftwaffe fighters that attempted to interfere with bomber formations. This meant that by 1945, B-24 and B-17 crews faced primarily flak rather than fighter opposition. Flak remained deadly, but losses decreased significantly compared to earlier in the war. The final months of operations in Europe saw mission after mission, where bomber formations returned with minimal or no losses. The crushing weight of American industrial production and the cumulative attrition of German defences had shifted the balance completely. The last B-24 combat mission in Europe was flown on April 25, 1945 against rail targets in Austria. By this date, German resistance was collapsing. Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly into Germany's interior. The strategic bombing campaign had accomplished its objectives, though at tremendous cost. German industry had been severely damaged. Transportation networks were destroyed. Oil production had been reduced to a fraction of wartime needs. German forces lacked fuel, ammunition, and supplies. The contribution of strategic bombing to victory remains debated, but the contribution of the men who flew the missions is beyond question. In the Pacific, B-24 operations continued until Japan surrendered in August 1945. The final missions attacked targets in China and Korea in early August. By this point, Japan's situation was hopeless. American forces controlled the sea lanes. Strategic bombing had destroyed Japanese cities and industry. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August eliminated any possibility of continued resistance. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Total B-24 combat losses during World War II are difficult to calculate precisely. Different sources cite different numbers depending on what categories of loss are included. The most comprehensive estimates suggest approximately 3,400 B-24 seconds were lost to all causes in all theatres during combat operations. This represents approximately 18% of total production. Not all losses were due to enemy action. Accidents, weather, mechanical failures, and operational losses accounted for a substantial portion. Approximately 18,000 aircrew members died flying B-24 seconds during the war. This number includes those killed in action, those who died as prisoners of war, and those who died in accidents. Thousands more were wounded or became prisoners of war and survived. The human cost of operating the B-24 fleet was staggering, comparable to the losses suffered by entire infantry divisions in ground combat. After the war ended, the vast majority of B-24 seconds were scrapped. The aircraft had been built for war production using methods that prioritized speed over longevity. They were worn out from intensive operations. The Air Force had no need for thousands of heavy bombers in peacetime. Most were flown to scrap yards in the southwestern United States, where they were cut apart and melted down for aluminum. A few were retained for testing and evaluation. A handful were sold to civilian operators for cargo operations. Today, only 2 B-24 seconds remain in flying condition. The Commemorative Air Force operates Diamond Lil, a B-24A built in 1941. The Collings Foundation operates Witchcraft, a B-24J restored to flying condition. Several additional B-24 seconds exist in museums in various states of preservation. but only these two still fly. This scarcity reflects both the aircraft's shorter peacetime survival compared to the B-17 and the greater difficulty of restoring and maintaining B-24 seconds due to their more complex systems and structural characteristics. The contrast with B-17 preservation is stark. Over a dozen B-17 seconds remain airworthy today. Many more exist in museums. The Flying Fortress's fame translated into greater preservation efforts. Organizations and individuals who wanted to preserve a heavy bomber usually chose the more famous B-17 over the less glamorous B-24. This pattern has reinforced the popular perception that the B-17 was the more important aircraft, even though operational records do not support this conclusion. The Luftwaffe's initial dismissal of the B-24 as an easy target proved catastrophically wrong. German fighter pilots who engaged B-24 formations learned quickly that the Liberator was a formidable opponent. Its speed made interception more difficult than attacking the slower B-17. Its defensive armament, when properly employed, could destroy attacking fighters. Its ability to absorb battle damage, while less than the B-17's legendary toughness, was still substantial. Many B-24 seconds returned to base with extensive damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. German intelligence assessments of American bomber capabilities consistently underestimated both aircraft production numbers and operational effectiveness. The idea that America could produce over 18,000 B-24 seconds while simultaneously producing nearly 13,000 B-17 seconds seemed impossible to German planners. Their own production capacity was limited by resources, industrial capacity, and bombing damage. They assumed American claims were propaganda, exaggerations. They were wrong. The B-24's true legacy lies not in direct comparison with the B-17, but in what its production and operational employment revealed about American industrial and military power. The United States designed, built, deployed, and operated the most complex aircraft of its era in quantities that overwhelmed enemy defenses through sheer numbers. This was not a matter of the B-24 being superior to the B-17. Both aircraft had strengths and weaknesses. The important point was that America built enough of both types to conduct strategic bombing campaigns in multiple theaters simultaneously, while also fielding massive ground and naval forces. Nazi Germany could not match this production. Japan could not match it. No other nation possessed the industrial capacity, raw materials, workforce, and organizational capability to accomplish what America accomplished. The B-24 production program at Willow Run alone represented an industrial achievement that exceeded the TTSDR, entire bomber production of most nations. When you add the output of Consolidated's plants in San Diego and Fort Worth, Douglas's plant in Tulsa, and North American's plant in Dallas, the scale becomes overwhelming. The strategic bombing campaigns in which B-24 seconds participated remain controversial. Historians debate whether strategic bombing shortened the war significantly or whether the resources devoted to bomber production and operations would have been more effective if allocated to other purposes. Defenders of strategic bombing argue that destruction of German industry, especially oil production, was essential to Allied victory. Critics argue that German production actually increased through 1944 despite bombing, and that the real contribution of strategic bombing was forcing Germany to divert resources to air defense that otherwise would have gone to frontline combat forces. This debate will likely never be conclusively resolved. What is beyond debate is the courage of the men who flew the missions. They did not make strategic policy. They did not choose their targets or decide whether strategic bombing was the optimal use of resources. They climbed into their aircraft, flew into intense defensive fire, completed their missions, and returned if they could. They did this mission after mission, knowing the statistics, seeing crew after crew fail to return, yet continuing to volunteer. Their sacrifice deserves recognition, regardless of debates about grand strategy. The B-24's technical characteristics reflected the fundamental compromises inherent in all engineering design. The Davis wing that gave such excellent range and efficiency made the aircraft less forgiving in flight. The deep fuselage that provided volume for fuel and bombs created awkward proportions and difficult evacuation routes. The tricycle landing gear that improved ground handling placed stress on the nosewheel structure. Every advantage came with corresponding disadvantages. This is not unique to the B-24. Every aircraft design involves compromises. The B-17's shorter range and lower service ceiling were prices paid for its structural toughness and lower landing speed. The Lancaster bomber's lack of defensive armament in certain positions was the price for its enormous bomb capacity. No perfect aircraft exists. Every design optimizes certain characteristics while accepting reduced performance in others. The men who flew B-24 seconds understood these compromises intuitively, even if they could not articulate them in engineering terms. They knew the aircraft's quirks, its demands, its capabilities. They flew it anyway. They learned to manage its higher landing speed, to respect its sensitivity to wing loading, to work within its limitations, and they accomplished extraordinary things. The final assessment must acknowledge both the B-24's achievements and its controversies. It dropped more bombs than the B-17 by a narrow margin. It flew in more theaters. It performed more diverse missions ranging from strategic bombing to submarine hunting to long-range reconnaissance. It was produced in greater numbers than any other American military aircraft in history. These are facts, documented and verified. It was also more difficult to fly than the B-17. It was less forgiving of pilot errors. It was more vulnerable to certain types of battle damage. It was less loved by its crews. These are also facts, documented in countless crew testimonials and accident reports. Both sets of facts are true. The B-24 was simultaneously an exceptional aircraft and a difficult, demanding one. The Luftwaffe's error was not in identifying the B-24's vulnerabilities. German intelligence correctly noted its high wing loading, its sensitivity to damage, its challenging flight characteristics. Their error was in concluding that these vulnerabilities made it an easy target. They failed to account for American production capacity that could replace losses faster than German forces could inflict them. They failed to account for crew training that taught pilots to manage the aircraft's demands. They failed to account for American determination to continue operations regardless of losses. Most fundamentally, they failed to understand that in industrial warfare, quantity has a quality of its own. A moderately effective weapon produced in vast quantities and employed with determination will defeat a superior weapon produced in limited numbers. The B-24 was not moderately effective. It was highly effective when properly employed. But even if it had been merely adequate, producing 18,000 of them would have made it decisive. The veterans who flew B-24 seconds carried mixed feelings about their aircraft through their post-war lives. Some spoke of it with genuine affection, praising its capabilities and defending it against critics. Others freely admitted they disliked flying it and would have preferred the B-17 if given a choice. Most fell somewhere between these extremes. They respected the aircraft. They acknowledged its role in victory. They honored their fallen comrades who died flying it. But they did not romanticize the experience. This honest, complex relationship with the aircraft is perhaps more meaningful than the uncomplicated devotion B-17 crews expressed for the Flying Fortress. The B-24 demanded more from its crews. It required greater skill, more constant attention, less margin for error. The crews rose to meet these demands. They mastered a difficult aircraft and used it to accomplish a vital mission. Their achievement deserves recognition equal to that given to B-17 crews, even if the aircraft itself never captured public imagination the way the Flying Fortress did. The B-24 Liberator flew 203,000 combat missions during World War II. It dropped approximately 635,000 tons of bombs on enemy targets. It helped close the Mid-Atlantic Gap and defeat the U-boat threat. It provided the long-range bombing capability essential to Pacific operations. It served in every theater, every role, under every condition. It was built by workers who had never built aircraft before. It was flown by young men barely out of their teens who learned to master its demands through training, experience, and sometimes sheer determination to survive. The Luftwaffe called it an easy target. They were wrong. The B-24 was not easy. Nothing about it was easy. Not the design, not the production, not the flying, not the combat. But easy was never the point. Effective was the point. Essential was the point. Decisive was the point. The B-24 Liberator was all of these things. And that is why, despite all controversies, despite all criticisms, despite being overshadowed in popular memory by its more famous cousin, the B-24 deserves its place among the great aircraft of World War II. The young men who flew it into combat did not care whether historians would remember their aircraft as fondly as the B-17. They cared about completing their missions, protecting their crew members, and surviving to go home. They accomplished these things in an aircraft that demanded their best and gave them the capability to deliver it. That is the real legacy of the B-24 Liberator. Not easy. Never easy, but always capable in the hands of determined men who refuse to quit. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.